back to Hi Guys VDR here. This is going to be a different type of AQ Worlds video, and I just want to talk about classes. So you guys know, in AQ Worlds, there are 100+ classes to choose from. Some are meta, some are not. But different variety of classes to go around. In this video, I want to talk about a pattern that I've noticed, and I'm pretty sure maybe I'm not the only one that's noticed this. Is that you know they've been releasing classes, like the past few class releases have either been, underperforming on release to the point they had to get buffed, near immediately, or the classes just turn out to be a complete nothing burger at all, even with, set changes, or they didn't get any changes, they're still a nothing burger. That's kind of what I want to talk about. I mean, disclaimer, this is, my opinion. If you agree or disagree, comment section right there, there or not. And also another disclaimer, this isn't a video to bash the people that are behind making the classes, the skills, the animations. This isn't a video, this isn't a video to bash them or say they don't know what they're doing and whatnot. It's just that this has kind of been a reoccurring pattern where it's kind of like the classes are, they're underwhelming or underperforming on release, or aka not worth the grind. And then it's the community says this out loud, and it gets buffed immediately, or we have to wait an entire year later for the devs to notice ayo, okay, maybe this class does need buffs. It's like an end game class and it isn't performing like one. It's not doing what it's supposed to do. That type of video. This is that type of video. So I wanted to start off with Virus Doom Knight. Now, Virus Doom Knight was the 2023 birthday class. Very excited, another Doom Knight class and whatnot. So, people read Doom Knight, Virus Doom Knight, breaking down, the opponent, whatnot. But the problem was, whatchamacallit, the mana cost, the damage, the darkness auras, and mainly just the damage. So, the class was made October of 2023, and nearly a week later, October 10th, 2023, changes, were made. Basically, they said in design notes, increase the base damage of all skills. Solo damage should be slightly higher than before. Also made adjustments to the class utility, reduced mana point cost, and increased the duration of darkness auras. While, they recognized that the class was underperforming on release, and, and they made some changes to it, and, because of that, Virus Doom Knight is, one of the best support classes in the entire game, and, probably the best debuffing class in the entire game currently. But, the issue is kind of how come they couldn't add this when they were making the class the first time around? I mean, it's the class had to get, buffed a week after release, which is kind of weird. You made a class and it's kind of a week later, it needs to get buffed because it's underperforming, which is kind of it leads to something oh, maybe they rushed while making Virus Doom Knight. They had to get it out by October of 2023, and it just feels they rushed to make it because, a week, changing, adding buffs to a class a week after it releases is kind of crazy, especially a birthday endgame class. That's extra crazy right then and there. But while, Virus Doom Knight, it's still a pretty good class in today's, meta. Pretty nice. One of the best support classes in the game. I'm just saying that, they could have added these changes from when they were still making the class rather than a week later, because it just seems like it's rushed. That Virus Doom Knight the first time around was a rushed product, and they righted their wrongs for it, which I feel like they shouldn't have had to do if they had more time to work on it and more testing phases. So that's pretty much it about Vera's Doom Knight. Now, let's move on to the next class. Alright then, so for our next class we have ArcaneInvoker. Now, ArcaneInvoker came out April of 2024. Alright? You know, the Darkon Endgame class. Excuse me. But it had its problems on release. You know, mana cost, survivability, having to ramp up all the way to the world. Yeah, definitely needed Elysium. So about like a week or two later, you know, changes happened. You know, make it more DPS focus, you know, increase the healing and debuff durations, and also, you know, making sure that your damage output. So they really like changed it to be a more deep DPS offensive class that you guys see today. And, you know, because of that, you know, ArcaneInvoker did get better with these changes. That's like what I've been saying since the beginning of the video. Is like the past few class releases, it's like in a sense they make them underwhelming, and then just like so they could just buff them like a week or two later, and it's just like with some of these changes that you see with the classes, you would have thought like, why couldn't they just add these you know said changes when they were still making the class, instead of just making an underwhelming class, dropping it, and then just like having to go back to work on it a week or two later, or even worse, a year later. I mean, so like ArcaneInvoker, while it is one of my favorite classes in the game, it's just like it just fell into that category, which was kind of like, you know, for the Darkon endgame class, you know, at first it had an underwhelming start, and then it got better. Like I said, some of these changes could have been added while they were still making the class, you know, the months in advance. So yeah, that's pretty much it for ArcaneInvoker. Alright then, let's move on to the next class. Alright then, so for our next class we have Sovereign of Storms, aka SOS. So around August of 2024, you know, AQW decided, you know, to introduce the concept of scaled classes. Now, for those who aren't familiar about, you know, what scaled classes are about, they are basically, you know, evolved versions of already existing classes. In this case, you know, Sovereign of Storms is, you know, is basically an evolved version of Darkblood Storm King. You know, introducing the scaled classes, which, you know, with the expectations of them functioning similarly to their base version and performing better than their base version, and, you know, requiring a reputation to obtain them. So yeah, Sovereign of Storms came out. You had to go fight the Queen Iona and whatnot. And this class, it didn't end up well at all. It was just seen as, you know, inferior to like the other, you know, endgame, you know, soloing classes like Void High Lord and Chaos Avenger. So it's like, if you had those, what was the point of grinding this? So, you know, a week or two later, you know, they decided to do some changes to Sovereign of Storms. They added icons because when this class first came out, it had the exact same icons as Darkblood Storm King. You know, changed all the skills to infinite and reduced the mana cost of its nuke Sky Splitter from 90 to 80 mana cost. And they changed up a passive skill as well. And, you know, not like changing it from 90 to 80 is still a lot of mana. Cause if they reduced it to like something like 50, you can say, or even 45, it would have been more acceptable. But, you know, because of this, it's just like Sovereign of Storms never had a chance to shine in the meta. You know, it's kind of like, why would I use this instead of like, you know, Void High Lord or Chaos Avenger or Chrono Shadow Slayer if I want DPS? And the grind for it is kind of like you were using those classes to grind Sovereign of Storms to the point it's like it was not even worth it. You know, got it to rank 10, and it unfortunately ended up being a bank class, a pretty forgettable class, which is not a good look for scaled classes, especially since this is the first scaled class that they have introduced, and we have another scaled class on the way in Lich. So it's just kind of like, you know, Lich, which is my bad. Lich is the scaled version of Necromancer class. Make sure to grind this as well. Which has some people, doubting, if they, since Sovereign of Storms ended up being a nothing burger, people will most likely fear that like Lich will also end up being a nothing burger class. Just like, Grim Necromancer. Answer two, and it's just like, there are people that have been maining Necromancer back when it was the undisputed best class in the game, back in the early to mid 2010s. And to see like an evolved version of it basically be worse than like its ancestor is gonna be crazy. Hey, so hopefully, 8-year-olds, redeems themselves with the second scaled class being Lich, and like Lich, is like meta relevant. You can like use it in ultras and whatnot. I'm not saying that Sovereign of Storms can be used in ultras, it's kind of like it's in that case of like, why would I use this when I have X, Y, and Z instead? Which, is a shame for the first ever scaled class. And, because of Sovereign of Storms ended up being like that, it will probably cause some fear about how they're going to manage scaled classes moving forward, especially with the Lich class coming out later on this year. So yeah, guys, it's pretty much been it. It's just like, it was just an unfortunate fate for Sovereign of Storms. Maybe people saw it coming the moment that this class didn't have its own icons on release. Alright then, let's move on to the next class. Alright then, so for our next class we got Martial Artist. Now everyone knows the history about Martial Artist. Last year's birthday class to commemorate the 16th birthday of AQ Worlds. Now this class, it never had a good rep in the first place. As it comes off, it was just the DPS was bad. And a bit complicated to learn, whatnot. And the pummel and whatnot. So a week or two later, it got changes. It did get some changes and whatnot. So yeah, it has as of October 18th, 2024, it did get the changes. It's kind of just like a mostly auto attack function. But the bad news is that auto attack is heavily reliant on server connectivity. So that means if you're on an overloaded server, like let's just say Arctics, it's kind of like the class is like basically unusable. Because like you need the pummel to like, deal the different effects based off your stance and whatnot. And it really turned out each skill now is 100 mana. That's pretty crazy. So like when concentration is done cooling down, you're basically stuck in this position. And because of that, it's just like it just leads people like, why am I gonna use this class for soloing? Even if I'm a late game player, this is not like it's not the class for even like a late game player to even use. It's like, why am I grinding this class outside of like getting another epic hero badge? And it just ended up being like, the butt of everyone's jokes. Like you can't even say underwhelming, like below underwhelming. You could say underwhelming is kind of like Vera's Doom Knight on release. And then it got a buff and now it's like, arguably the best debuffing class in the entire game. Meanwhile, Martial Artists did get some changes and it went from like under the dirt to like on the dirt. That's like a good analogy. Yep, went from under the dirt to on the dirt. And it's just never seen the light of time because like it just ended up becoming a class like, what's the point of using this class when I have X, Y, and Z, which are all infinitely better at soloing? You would have thought like, they made this class so it could be able to compete with said, classes like Chaos Avenger, Void High Lord, Chronos, etc. But it just really isn't. It's even then the DPS is bad. Even if you try to use like Dauntless or Ravenous, it's just like there are classes that you could use those exact same enhancements on and get way more out of it than this class, which is disappointing because it's like this is a birthday class. an anniversary class that they definitely took months to make, and it just ended up becoming a complete forgotten about nothing burger of a class. Like I really hope in the future they probably take like one last look at martial artists, maybe give it some buffs or maybe give it a complete rework because it's like it's a shame that this class has like a unique design, but the execution was just terribly executed. So yeah, guys, that's pretty much been it for the martial artist, and it just ended up becoming martial bank artist. Just shove it in your bank and just completely forget about it. All right then, let's move on to the last class. All right, for our last class, well, even though as of recording of this video, it's still in its testing phase, I haven't heard any good about it. And that class is the upcoming, recently, the Holloworn Vindicator class. Now, the thing is, right, we finally get the end game class for the Holloworn faction, and a it's basically another version of Exalted Harbinger. And it's just kind of disappointing to see that even when you look at the skills, it's like I'm pretty sure like what everyone else has been saying, this is literally just Exalted Harbinger just with modern animations. It is a shame though because it's like everyone was expecting this class to have its own identity or similar, you know, or something that's like that's related to Hollowborn, kind of like ArcaneInvoker with the tarot readings and whatnot. It's just you expected like something lay related to Hollowborn Vindicator, not be a duplicate of an already existing class that doesn't even see that much that sees little to no play anyway in today's game. And based on what I've seen, it's just like, this classes like Hollowborn Vindicator and Exalted Harbinger, they're only they're only at their best when you're at super low HP, which that doesn't work in ultras. So it's like majority of ultra bosses, they get buffed every time a player dies and whatnot. And you could say, okay, just do soloing, non-ultras and whatnot. It's like you already have, I'm pretty sure most players that are grinding for Hollowborn Vindicator already have access to, Chaos Avenger, Void High Lord, Chaos, Chrono Shadow Slayer, etc. So it's just like right now, even though it's a testing phase, it's kind of looking like, why am I grinding this class outside of the Epic Hero badge? Even some people are even calling for like a rework or a complete overhaul of the skills. Now the testing phase is still going on for like a little while. Probably like I think it ends in like a week or two. So we'll see what happens. When they drop the final product, will it stay the same or will it like, give it a fresh coat of paint? We shall see what happens later on in the month. I mean, kudos to them at least to like, they gave us a testing phase and whatnot. But it is kind of disappointing to see that this new class, this Hollowborn Vindicator, what you would expect like a completely new class, instead it's kind of like a scaled version of Exalted Harbinger. And the class, it's like it's only good when it's basically at the brink of death. Which kind of leaves you open for some boss that could just like, flick you and then just like, go about their day. And while it does have some survivability, whatnot, it's just like it's not really worth the risk than just running the standard comp for, said ultra fight. But hopefully it does get a new fresh coat of paint, like its own identity, because it's crazy how this class doesn't have its own identity, but like martial artists, it's like you could say it has its own identity. It's just that the execution was bad. Meanwhile, Hollowborn Vindicator is just Exalted Harbinger with Hollowborn animations, which is pretty damn disappointing. But we shall see what happens after the testing phase. Maybe they could like find a way to like make it better, or just slap a new fresh coat of paint and see how that works. Even then, another thing I've heard about Hollowborn Vindicator is that it's basically If you don't have Dauntless, there is no point of grinding this class. And I think that's like another problem because it feels like not every endgame player has Dauntless. We got to be real about that to ourselves. And that's okay. There are some people that just got to endgame. There's some people that just came back from an extended break from the game. It's okay. But I feel like, for a class, especially for like an end game class, you kind of wanted to, make it work with at least like a 2 or 3 weapon enhancements. I mean, with Legion Revenant, you can make it work with Arcanas or Valiants, and even Praxis at times. And with Void High Lord, you can make it work with Dauntless or Ravenous or even Smite. And lastly, for Chaos Avenger, you could, your choice of like Ravenous or Valiants. So you got to understand what I'm saying. And here it's just like for an endgame class to only be good with only one enhancement, it really is not looking good so far for Holloworn Vindicator. And that hopefully by the time the testing phase is over, they can actually make some changes to the point you could use it with other enhancements as well. And even then, from what I'm hearing also is that, what I'm hearing and seeing is that even with Dauntless, it's like you would rather run another class with Dauntless, like say Void High Lord. Alright then, that's pretty much it for this video. The whole purpose of this video was not to like bash the class development team. And to say that this is like an ongoing pattern where it's kind of like you drop a class that's like underperforming on release and then like a week or two later it gets buffed, and we're taking that gamble of like, did the buff save it or made it worse? Or classes that just like never really saw the light of day, like Sovereign of Storms, and Master Artist and Martial Artist, and that if this pattern keeps on going, it's going to be a lot more skepticism when a new class drops, like for example the Lich class and the Anniversary class that drops in October. That if this pattern keeps on going, it's going to be like it lessens the hype because it's like, why am I grinding this class outside of an Epic Hero badge when I have XYZ class? And even then, this new class can't compare to, it's not on the level of those classes or even higher than XYZ class. So what's the point of grinding for it other than an Epic Hero badge? And especially going through a 4-week ultra like Hollow Vindicator right now. So that's pretty much it for this video. I mean, and I know this question's bar gonna pop up like, oh, BDR, what do you want to see? Like, I think that I want to see these classes like, I want to see more testing phases. Like every time, like even with like a scaled class, I do believe for every new class that's about to release, there should be a testing phase, and that they should take more time with the classes. Like it's better to have like a class take extremely long to make than like drop a class as soon as possible and it's completely underwhelming. I'll just, rephrase that. I would rather have a class that takes like long, like very long to make, but it's good on release, than drop a class as soon as possible and it just feels completely rushed, underwhelming to the point it's like we have to call out for a buff like 2 seconds after people get it to rank 10. So yeah, that's basically it. Like, how do you guys feel about these, these recent class releases like Martial Artist, Sovereign of Storms, Holloworn Vindicator, etc. You know, does there has to be changes? Is everything okay, or or is it just like, oh, the AQ Roads community complains too much? Drop down your opinions in the comment section below. And also as always, like, share, subscribe, and yeah, hi guys, out.